My name Kyle, 39 years old, married to my wife Kayla, 36, for almost 12 years we would have. Celebrated our 12th marriage anniversary in a few months, but unfortunately, she passed away around 6 weeks ago. My wife was diagnosed with leukemia around 5 years ago. Hey folks, before we dive into today's video, I'd really appreciate your support. Subscribing is one of the best ways to help us out. It's quick, free, and keeps the awesome content coming. Every listen, like, and share truly means a lot. Let's keep this channel growing. Thank you so much. Kayla fought long and hard, but I still lost her. I spent a lot of time with her in these past few years. Sand was her primary caregiver, so I don't track her at anything since I know that it treated my very best. My wife was a writer bear. She passed, she had written some stories, but was known to only a very niche audience, so it didn't earn much. Which is why she took to ghostwriting. Made a lot of money. I have a bookstore of my own, and while I'm not as successful as my wife, I still make a comfortable living on my own. In my wife's will, she left me most of her money and assets, which was quite a low after settling her medical bills. It came up to around $750. She'd left her family with $75,000 as well, but nothing else, Andy Van, that seemed way too much for me. The reason was that her family wasn't truly very attached to her. And even in her last days, they barely ever visited her in hospital. They would only ever call when they needed money, and she would happily send them whatever amount they said, but I guess while she was in the hospital, she realized that they didn't love her as much as she thought they did, which made her change her will and leave a lot less money to them. Tanshed initially intended to, her family included, her parents and her two younger brothers, both in their late 30s. No, one of them runs their family dinner and the other works at a law firm anyway. Last week, family dropped Bivery unexpectedly and said that they had to discuss something urgent with me. He was a little confused since they had barely even spoken to me after the funeral, or even while my wife was sick. As a matter of fact, sold them just visiting me out of the blue to talk about something important. Seemed kinda offishy to me. Once they were seated, they brought out a bunch of papers and told to go through them. They were letters and notices from several people about my wife's death, and now that they verified word that she's passed away, need me to clear those debts at the earliest, or else I'll be in trouble. I was shocked since I didn't even know if my wife had any debts to speak of since she lived a clean life, and like I mentioned earlier, we didn't need to borrow money. We were comfortable and ought to afford the things we wanted or needed, so this whole debt business seemed crazy though. Her family explained that she'd racked up a lot of debts while she'd been living by herself and still hadn't paid them off, even though she had the means to. She told them to keep it as credit from me, but now the debtors were harassing them, and they couldn't afford to pay it all off at once, since it wasn't coming up to $100. Because of fee time and interest. I was dumbstruck at that moment, since even though I definitely could pay it all off, it would create a significant debt, and I also found it very hard to believe that Sumian, as meticulous as my wife, would refuse to pay her debts. Or there was a short period before we met, and after she'd moved out of her family home, where she'd been living on her own, and hadn't made it as a writer yet, that shuttled me about, so that part of Thestry definitely checked out. She'd even confessed to having a hard time dealing with the bills and said that she'd had to take up several tutoring jobs to be able to make ends meet before her book was finally published, but she never mentioned anything about loans or debts, and not once in our 12 years of marriage had anything of the sort ever come up to her family's visit, and these papers had taken me by surprise. I could hardly believe that my wife would do something like this and keep such a huge secret from me, and the more I thought about it, the less likely it seemed out. I told her family that I'd need some time to arrange for the money, since they'd requested it to be in all cash, and they seemed kind of annoyed that I wasn't just handing them over the money right then and there, but they didn't say anything, and told me I had a week the next day. However, I decided to talk to my late wife's secretary to discuss her finances, because something about this situation just seemed off. I asked her if my wife had ever mentioned any debts of the sort, and even showed her papers, and she looked just as surprised as I did. She told me that my wife had absolutely zero debts left clear before she passed, and so this was news to her. These debtors were alone. Sharks as well, so I didn't really have any way to check out if they were alleged or not, and so-called documents that I'd been handed were mostly letters about how it would be unwise to try to over them any longer, now that they'd finally tracked us down, and seemed threatening, if I'm being honest, for Asakon. I thought my best bet would be to just give her family the money and let him take care of it all, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being toyed with, so I decided to speak to my wife's best friend. Her cousin Anjen ended up telling me a lot of things that drove away any fear that I had shuttled me, that all those papers that he'd been handed were probably forged by my wife's parents, since they'd been after her money ever since she made a name for herself as a writer. She had even left home. Voluntarily, she'd been kicked out by her parents after college, since she'd wanted to be a writer, and her parents would think it was a very stable corruption after a lot of fights and arguments. They told her that they weren't interested in speaking to Heronless. She started making sufficient money and kicked her out. That really hurt her, but she didn't turn back or give up and started working part-time as a waitress, tutoring kids, and even working on her books alongside all of that to keep going. And no, she'd never taken a single loan from anyone and was completely self-made. My wife's friend was 100% convinced that Mune laws were lying to me and told me to test my theory by speaking to my lawyer and cross-checking, and just to decline me and law's request to see how they react. So I took her advice and decided to tell her family that I was not giving them any money and I would deal with the debtors directly myself, and just as I'd expected, they were outraged at the suggestion and started telling me that this money had to be handed over to them first in any case, and my refusing to do so meant that I didn't trust them. I was already feeling pretty suspicious of both whole situation, and their reactions just confirmed all my doubts. They most definitely were lying, and all it would take was for my lawyer to deduce if the documents were forged or not. So after a couple of days, he confirmed that all felon sharks that they named had been contacted, and none of them had ever even heard of, let alone loaned any money to my wife, so she was in the clear. I just couldn't believe that her family was harassing their late daughter's husband for money just a couple of weeks after her passing. This was the lowest think that they could do, and they did. So honestly, if they just asked me for money, then I probably would have given it to them anyway, because I have way more to know for right now to lead a comfortable life. But they chose to lie and trick him, and even tried to make my wife seem like a careless and dishonest person, which I absolutely could not forgive. They've been trying to contact him, but I haven't responded yet because I didn't know what to say to them, yet they planned to just throw me under the bus on take much more than they were owed. And, in my opinion, they weren't owed muxins. They'd never bothered to treat my wife well. So, I think even what she left for them was much more than they deserved, than thinking about cutting them offenderly and suing them for the money thought my wife had left to them. They don't deserve it even one bit, and I could think of several other people who had actually been there for her when she was sick and could do with the money very on and slide if I sued. My late wife's family over their inheritance update one eye. Finale answered their calls and spoke to my father-in-law. He was pestering me at booth money and asked me when I'd be handing them the cash, since the dip torse were hounding them mercilessly. Now obviously I knew that he was lying to Menno, and I told him that I'd cross-checked with our family lawyer, and Ick knew that he faked all those papers just to take the money from me, and he could have. And now, well, the first few minutes after my accusation, he pretended not talk now what I was talking about, and said that I'd lost my mind, but I remained firm on my point, and eventually he was forced to admit that he'd been lying, but he started trying to emotional and manipulate me by saying that it was totally unfair that my wife had left most of her money to me instead of them, since they're the ones who had raised her, zest her, and had made her capable of becoming a successful writer in the first place, so they were owed a lot more than they were given. It was ironic to hear him saying that, because while they had raised her, they'd also been the ones talking her out, and refused to help her out when she was struggling. They didn't even contact her until her first book started suing, well, which was several years after she'd been kicked out, but she'd been kind enough to welcome them back into her life with open arms. Even Thenthi hadn't been kind to her, and wouldn't use her for her money. They didn't visit her when she was sick, and neither did they try to arrange anything for her funeral. So in my opinion, whatever they'd been given was more than enough. I told them that I wouldn't be giving them even a single dollar more than what they already had, and informed them of my decision to sue them as well. That led to some more outrage, and he tried to argue with me, but I wasn't interested in what they had to say and just hung up. I blocked them. We're served with the lawsuit today, and they were very unhappy about it, obviously, but they decided to let me know how unhappy they were by paying me visit and trying to make me feel guilty for stealing their inheritance from them. I was shocked that they'd even had the guts to show up at my house after what they tried to do, and while it told them to leave me alone from within house itself, without even opening the door, they were very stubborn and refused to leave without having a word with me. First, it was my father-in-law and his wife who'd come to visit me, and they thought that they could make me feel sorry for them by sobbing about how they were in mourning already, and now they were about to lose so much money as well. I don't know why they believe I would buy their silly sympathy-seeking act, since I, for one, knew exactly how heartlessly they treated my wife. She might have forgiven them because they were her family, but they weren't my family, and so I had no need to forgive them at all. After they were done ranting, I told them that I wasn't going to change my mind, and they needed to leave for importance of family values and how I should be standing by their side at a time like this when both families are grieving a huge loss, but instead swing him over something as petty as money. I thought that was bold of her since I'd never thought about any of this one. Just weeks ago, they were lying to me and trying to trick me into giving up me share of the money for their own grief, and after how they treated my wife, I was funny to hear her talk about family values because their family lacked any values at all. I told them to leave once more, or else I really would call the police, and that led to them finally leaving. They were very pissed off. By the time they left and told Method I would definitely lose this one, but I didn't care about winning or losing. I was doing this more for my wife. For myself, she never tried to put their family in their place because she was just too kind and forgiving, but I am not that person. And moreover, after my wife's death, I don't feel like I have even to try and maintain the facade of a happy relationship with my in-laws anymore. They're nothing more than parasites who are leeching off of my wife's money, and now it's time to Macasier. They learn what happens to leeches since they're found. I have no regrets about what I'm about to do, and if people find me ruthless, then so be. Update 3 had the first hearing today, and it was difficult facing my in-laws in such a formal and legal setting. I did think that my wife wouldn't be happy with what I'm doing, and it probably isn't my place to sue them anyway for her sake, but then I remembered their capacity for cruelty. They tried to extort money out of me through deception. And they didn't decline it. Instead, AUD owed up to it because then they'd be able to build up to their own emotional sob story, their lawyer accusing them of manipulating their daughter to keep most of her assets and money to myself, while they only received a very small sum. Apparently, I was a controlling husband. It took advantage of my wife's illness and forced her to sign her will against her wishes and made her leave everything to me, while my in-laws were cheated out of it all. I wasn't even surprised that they were coming up with this rubbish story to malign my imagescence. They are most certainly very capable of such things. My lawyer was there to defend me, however, in event though everyone present in the room knew that I was absolutely not the guy that they were making me out to be. We still had to prove it, and that's going to be a piece of cake for me. I guess they should have thought things through before lying through their teeth about my character best. Whatever they said was certainly going to be a match with what all 04 friends and the rest of my wife's family had seen anyway after the meeting me in-laws. At least not now, because then they think that it was okay to harass me for the rest of my life, just like they'd done to me wife, and I wasn't about to let them got away with it. I told them that they could come up with all the lies about Method they wanted to, but the truth was going to be out eventually, so I wasn't too worried for myself, and they couldn't intimidate me into backing off now, as though my wife's brothers tried to tell them off for speaking to their parents rudely, but I had no time to spare for these people and just drove off. We'll meet again 2 weeks later, and I'm going to gather all the proof I can to pro-aff it whatever they're making me out. Tobe is absolutely not the case, and it's just a bunch of lies that they made up to get the money quicker. And easier, Andy? No, it's going to be easy, for only 2 days have passed since the hearing and today. It's almost 7 in the morning, right? Now, and I've had the craziest night. Honestly, at around midnight, I heard some footsteps around my house. Booty was really tired, so I dismissed it, thinking that it must have been my exhaustion getting to me, and didn't pay any mind to it and just went to sleep. Only an hour later, I was woken by the sound of glass breaking and the loud thud outside my house, followed by an oath or two, and stayed in bed for the next few minutes until I was sure that my neighbors were outside as well. As soon as I heard the hubbub outside, I went out to check what had happened, and saw that all the windows of my neighbor's car had been smashed in with rocks that had messages scrawled on them in chalk. It said "back off" in white letters, and immediately I knew that this was probably something that my wife's brothers had done. It was hilarious to me that instead of macking her, that they were getting the right car, they'd ruined the wrong one. Manabra was a young woman in her late 22s who had a toddler, and she worked hard, and she'd been excited about this car as well. She bought it just a few weeks ago, because obviously this was bound to hurt, I explained the situation to her and how me wife's brothers must have gotten the... It turns out my car was safely parked in the garage. The car that had been vandalized belonged to my neighbor, who usually leaves hers in the driveway since her garage was under renovation. I immediately offered to pay for the repairs, but she told me not to worry, said she knew I had enough going on already. She assured me she'd take care of it. Of course, what she meant was that she was going to press charges against my wife's brothers and make them cover the damage. Honestly, that made me feel a little better. She was incredibly kind about it, probably because she'd been close friends with my wife. About 15 minutes later, the police arrived. We explained everything, and I gave them the address where her brothers were staying. I went down to the station with my neighbor. Another kind neighbor offered to stay back and watch her kid. We waited at the station for about 30 minutes while the officers made the arrest. It didn't take long. Despite trying to resist like fools, they were completely caught off guard. They'd been so sure I wouldn't call the police and that they had the right car. When the cops showed up, they even tried to flee down the fire escape, which obviously didn't work. Even then, they had the audacity to shove officers and attempt to run again. Once they saw me, they started yelling, blaming me for their sister's death, as if their angry outbursts would help their case in any way. But after my neighbor pressed charges and positively identified them, we were free to leave. I got home about an hour ago, and I haven't been able to sleep. I'm just stressed. I wish they'd just leave me alone at this point. Update 5. The little guys, it's been 3 weeks since my last update, and I've got some good news. My in-laws no longer have the $75,000 they inherited from my wife. They were forced to settle, and the entire amount was handed over to me. They also had to pay my neighbor for the damage caused to her car. As for my wife's brothers, they got into serious legal trouble for what they did. The charges went on their record, which helped me in court. It supported my argument that their actions were driven purely by greed. Honestly, the evidence was so overwhelming that it was no surprise. They lost the case. Since then, I haven't heard a word from my in-laws, and I'm grateful for that. Good riddance. Like I said before, I never intended to keep the money for myself. I've always been content with what I have. Instead, I decided to divide the money among the people who truly stood by my wife when she needed them most. I gave a portion to her secretary, someone my wife loved like family. She initially refused to accept it, but after I insisted, she accepted it as a gift. I also sent some to her cousin, who used to drive 2 hours every weekend to visit her in the hospital. She did everything she could to cheer my wife up, and I'll never forget that. The only 2 times I've ever seen her cry were at my wife's funeral, and when I handed her the check and thanked her for everything. This whole process has been deeply emotional. But I'm at peace knowing I honored my wife's memory by doing something meaningful for the people who loved her. I just hope she's smiling wherever she is.